Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm John Stein, Executive Director of the Open Voice Network, and I'd like to welcome you to the first installment of our new webinar series, Global Standards for Conversational AI. It's a webinar series from the Open Voice Network. This series is a joint coordination of white papers and webinars published and hosted by the communities and working groups of the Open Voice Network. And in today's inaugural webinar, you'll hear from members of our Privacy and Security Work Group as they highlight key findings from their recent publication, Privacy Principles and Capabilities Unique to Voice. It's their 2.0 version. It's a white paper. And as the presentation concludes today, I encourage you to stay for a scheduled Q&A session with members of this work group. And to start us off, let me introduce you to Oita Coleman. She's Senior Advisor of the Open Voice Network, and she'll be leading you through today's webinar and introducing additional panelists. Oita has over 30 years experience in the tech industry, where she's spent time as the R&D Vice President of Software Quality at SAS Institute, overseeing implementations of global processes, standards, and policies for the software development lifecycle. And as part of the Open Voice Network, she leads the privacy, security, and ethical use portfolio of our effort, focused on voice-specific guidance for both the protection of individual and commercial user data privacy and security for consumer-facing enterprises worldwide. She's been recognized as the top 50 most powerful women in tech award recipient by the National Diversity Council, as well as one of the women who make a difference in technology by U.S. Black Engineer and IT Magazine. We are so proud to have Oita as part of us. Oita, thank you for your dedication and contribution to the Open Voice Network and for leading us through this Privacy Principles and Capabilities Unique to Voice webinar. The floor is yours, my friend.
All right, John, thank you for the introduction. And on behalf of the Privacy and Security Work Group, thank you for the opportunity to present the work of our dedicated colleagues who have given of their time, talents, and expertise to deliver this important work. In a 2021 study conducted by Vixen Labs in partnership with the Open Voice Network, findings indicated that privacy concerns are a barrier in adoption of voice technologies. Roughly half of all voice users in the US, UK, and Germany agreed that privacy of voice data was a major concern. To overcome this barrier, it is important to establish trust. Making voice worthy of user trust is why we are working to develop technology standards and guidelines that protect consumer and commercial data and to link all voice assistants in an interoperable world. And in this world, it is critical that we establish guidelines on how data is collected, shared, and used. The Privacy and Security Work Group has completed an important work towards that step. In defining those guidelines and the publishing of the Privacy Principles and Capabilities Unique to Voice version 2.0 white paper. It is a step designed to benefit members of the voice technology ecosystem, from platform providers to independent developers, conversational designers, and enterprise leaders, and most of all, to the users of voice technology. I'd like to introduce two members of the Privacy and Security Work Group who will share more details on the completed work. First, I'd like to present Nick Myers, co-moderator of the Privacy and Security Work Group. Nick is the co-founder and CEO of Red Fox AI, headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, and is also co-moderator of the Open Voice Network Privacy and Security Work Group, focusing on privacy. Nick is a TEDx and international keynote speaker, having spoken at events and conferences across the US and around the world on artificial intelligence and the future of work, data privacy, and the impact of voice-enabled technologies on human to machine and machine to human interactions. Nick and his work have been featured in publications including PR Daily, the Wisconsin State Journal, WisHealth News, and the Journal of Digital and Social Media Marketing. Also, we are pleased to have Brenda Leong, who serves as one of the Open Voice Network industry advisors. Brenda is a partner at B&H Brenda also serves as an adjunct professor at Pennsylvania State University Law School. Previously, Brenda was senior counsel and director of AI and ethics at the Future of Privacy Forum, where she oversaw the development of privacy education, implementation, and analysis of AI and ML technologies for Future of Privacy member companies, which include many of the largest companies in the world. She was also the expert voice for Future of Privacy on the responsible use of biometrics and digital identity, with a focus on facial recognition, facial analysis, and emerging issues around voice-operated systems. Prior to her work at Future of Privacy Forum, Brenda served in the U.S. Air Force. She is a 2014 graduate of George Mason University School of Law. So welcome, Brenda and Nick. Nick, let's start with you. Talk about the recently released publishing privacy guidelines document. Nick.
Thank you, Alyssa. I was just sending you a message right now. I'm like, I can't unmute myself. Thank you. No, thank you for that great introduction, Oita. It's an absolute pleasure to, of course, be here with you and Brenda to talk about the really outstanding work that the Open Voice Network and specifically the Open Voice Network's Privacy and Security Work Group have produced here over the last several months. And with that being said, you know, I knew from day one joining the Open Voice Network, my gosh, back at the start of 2020, which feels like forever ago now, that data privacy is something that I knew I personally wanted to focus on. And all I can say is that, you know, I never thought I would be a part of producing a paper like this that lays such crucial groundwork to privacy specific to voice. And just being able to work alongside so many just intelligent, dedicated, and passionate people has been amazing. So again, this paper would not be possible with all of the work of everybody in the work group. So for those of you from the work group who are on this webinar today, thank you. But really, of course, why are we doing this paper, right? Why did we put in the countless hours of meetings and writing and discussion and, you know, the 1,000 cups of coffee to actually make this a possibility? Well, from day one, you know, the number one thing that still stands with me from Project Voice 2020, when John Stein spoke to a group of us, is that one of the foremost and most important goals of the Open Voice Network is to close that user trust gap, right? And we know that trust gap is there. And quite frankly, if we don't have trust, especially with voice technology, sure, the adoption numbers are out there, people are using it, but if we can't close that gap, this technology will not grow in the way that we all want it to, right? I think all of us on this call can agree with that. And thus we went to work trying to establish how are we going to close this user trust gap. And of course, through all of the research that we did, you know, it became very clear that as great as regulations like GDPR are, CCPA, you know, other patchwork state legislation in the US, and of course, the major platform providers who, of course, have done a great job at getting voice into the wider market, they do not address the specific privacy risks and specifically call out a series of principles to help mitigate those risks. So that's what we went to work to do. And we established a set of principles and capabilities specific to voice that we hope really lays the groundwork for closing that user trust gap. And I think we can all agree and see right now, technology is in a very interesting state, right? It runs our lives essentially, but more so now than ever before, people are cognizant of their data. They're cognizant of how firms and companies and organizations are collecting that data. And we're seeing all across the board, the greater public all across the world really demand that change. And we're really hopeful at the Open Voice Network, specifically in this work group, that of course, from the voice standpoint, we can really start listening and taking those claims into account to set these principles so we can make some meaningful progress. And of course, looking at a lot of the work the interoperability group has been doing over the last several months, it has become clear, I think, to all of us recently that privacy will be one of the biggest challenges in an interoperable voice world, right? So the work that we did here is incredibly important. But with that being said, I want to quickly give you a brief overview of the paper itself. And I have it open on a separate monitor here, so I may reference some different quotes from this. But, looking at the introduction of all this, voice assistants greatly increase the stake for personal privacy, right? I mean, of course, looking at some data from the OVON and Vixen Labs report from 2021, the daily usage of voice assistants is now over 30%, with weekly usage being almost 50% in the United States, UK, and Germany. These aren't small numbers when you take large populations into account, right? So people are clearly flocking to voice and use it, but at the same time, the privacy problem hasn't been solved. So there's all of these open doors and privacy risks in the realm of voice. So, we view, at least in terms of a working definition of privacy, because through all the countless hours of research, right, there really isn't a global standard definition of privacy, which I think confused a lot of us. But, when we get down to it, privacy lacks a standard global definition. And really, academics have compared it to usability and security, holistic properties of interactive systems, right? But we broke down user privacy. We can view it from two different perspectives. And the first one is privacy issues unique to voice to machine environments, right? So that interaction between a user and a voice assistant, voice agent in, that voice to machine, voice enabled environment. And the second one is privacy risks between users and third parties when human speech is the primary conduit in voice to machine environments. And this includes two very important points, subpoints, I should say, being an individual owns their own voice data, unless specifically stated otherwise. Mind-blowing concept there. We look at how data is collected and how people view ownership right now, right? But we're making that claim. And two, voice data is classified as personal information, subject to personal information laws and regulations. So that is our working definition of privacy. And those are the assertions that we're really driving in order to establish these different principles. And we look across the world, right? We look at the different data protection regulations that are out there. Of course, we have GDPR, which was one of the most progressive data privacy laws in the world that we realize does align in many different ways with our principles and capabilities. However, it was only up until last year they decided to include information about virtual voice assistants with the European Data Protection Board, right? Which we did respond to, but that really is the only, in terms of formal law and regulation, anything that addresses voice. And then, of course, we look through the United States and North America, right? There still is no comprehensive federal law on data privacy. And we have a patchwork network of regulations, including California Privacy Act, and of course, Virginia signed one into law at the start of the year. And of course, Illinois has had one since 2020. But what's interesting about all of these is none of them include or address our principles of transparency, consent, limited collection, and control. So our goal, of course, as we flesh these out and bring them to the table, that maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to twist the arm of a lawmaker to be able to include these in some future regulations, right? That would be an incredible goal to reach. But with that being said, I'm just trying to figure out we did an enterprise privacy policy review as well, right? And we took a look at some of the major platform providers in the voice ecosystem, right? So we did some research on Amazon, Google, Apple, and Microsoft and Facebook, really to try and get a gauge of where their minds were at in terms of data privacy, specifically when it comes to voice. And we essentially drew three conclusions from that include, but are not limited to, data processors collect vast amounts of personal data from consumers. They collect vast amounts of personal data from consumers under the protection of implied consent. And there is a lot of ambiguous language that allows each data processor a high degree of limited liability when it comes to ethical data collection, data use, and privacy. So in that regard, our principles are not addressed by any of the major platform providers. Again, something we hope as we push for some of these changes and our principles to be taken mainstream, to be incorporated into their privacy frameworks. So when we look at the risk for privacy, right, there are two privacy risks that we identified. The first one, personal data collected during a voice assistant conversation without consent from the user that may cause harm to the user, right? Specifically that consent piece. We live in a world where, yes, there's terms and conditions and there's consent, but how many of us right here now have actually sat and read through all of those different terms and conditions that we have agreed to. I bet it is a very small percentage, and no one should feel guilty about that. I myself have breezed through them. But that consent piece is very important. And then the second privacy risk that we identified is personal and sensitive data is inadvertently revealed to others during confirmation and playback and shared and used in ways that may cause harm to the user because of the voice-enabled environment, right? Because it's ambient. There's a huge privacy risk there. So with those risks identified, here are our principles. And I will go through these as efficiently as possible. So again, transparency, consent, limited collection, and control. Transparency. When we talk about transparency, we talk about a voice-initiated user interface, VUI, must be made easily accessible and readily available to the consumer for the purpose of providing user notification and data collected practices, general data usage, and data sharing policies. That transparency piece is incredibly important because, again, from the research we did with the major firms, there really isn't a whole lot of transparency in what is collected. Again, a lot of it falls under that implied consent. So we considered a voice-enabled environment, transparency, so the user knows what exactly is being collected, and of course, how it is being used, is paramount. Another point to our transparency principle is privacy policy notifications should be adapted for text-to-speech playback, as well as made available in other modes that are accessible and adapted to users and devices, right? The voice interface is a brand new interface, right? Relatively speaking. And when it comes to privacy policies and the legal framework they're currently written as, they're not designed for text-to-speech playback. So those are two big points for transparency that I wanted to highlight. The second is consent. Of course, defining consent as the voluntary agreement to or in acquiescence with another proposes or desires. So when it comes to consent, two things I want to draw to attention here. Data subjects or users must be allowed to give explicit, unambiguous consent before the collection and processing of personal data. No exceptions. Consent needs to be on behalf of the user before any data collection. Again, bringing transparency into that as well. The user needs to be aware and needs to give explicit consent. No more implied consent. Well, I shouldn't say that. There'll probably always be implied consent, but we need to give the user as much consent as possible. And 2.4, data must not be used for voice inference training without consent from the user, right? I mean, all the major platform providers do this, independent platform providers. We need that voice data to train the system, but we need to communicate that better to the user. And we need to give them the autonomy and the authority to consent to that inference training. Moving on to limited collection and use. So of course, first point here, the collection and analysis of raw and processed voice data beyond that necessary for immediate dialogue functionality should be used only for its stated and creator consent given purpose. No more, no less. And of course, providers should collect the minimum amount of raw and processed data necessary for the stated and consent given purpose. So processors only using what data is necessary to accomplish the goal. And if you want to collect more than that, consent and transparency, right? So you're starting to see hopefully how these connect. And then lastly here, control. So any data that is not deleted must be accessible by the user with the ability to review, correct, or securely delete that data. In light of everybody finding out that some of the major firms are having humans listen onto those, the greater discussion of control was brought to light, and luckily some strides have been made there, but it needs to be better. And then of course, a really big point here, portability of data, right? So the consumer has the right to portability of voice data to reuse it for their own purposes, something that just needs to be reflected across all technology, right? So the voice technology platform must provide the consumer at their request any data that is held by the platform to use that in a way that is easy for them. So those are some major highlights of our different privacy principles. But looking ahead in terms of a plan of action and what we have looking ahead of us. So one thing we've been talking about is potentially a generic voice privacy policy template, because that currently does not exist, to try and bring in some of these principles for designers and developers, reviewing further legislation. And I think the big goal here is establish an open voice network privacy certification. So maybe enterprise designers and developers can self-certify that they meet these guidelines and principles. So I know I went over time. There was a lot to go over here, but hopefully that gives you a really solid overview of this incredible work that we all did.
All right. Thank you, Nick. You shared only a high-level overview of the document, and we look forward to sharing the link to the document and getting feedback from those of you who are listening, and we'll share that information. So Brenda is joining us as an industry expert on privacy. Brenda, please share your thoughts on the importance of the privacy guidelines and standards to users and enterprise stakeholders.
Thanks, Oita. Thanks for inviting me to join today. And I'll try to keep it brief so we have time for questions at the end, because I would definitely like to hear the thoughts and questions of the people on the call. Nick already covered pretty thoroughly the legal context of the environment for biometrics in general, voice in particular, the fact that there really isn't a legal environment in many cases to apply other than within general privacy laws at state level, of course, GDPR in the EU. But as we know, there's a large momentum in a lot of places to more directly control, whether it's at sort of targeting AI systems, which, voice and natural language processing would certainly fall under in terms of requirements and limitations there, whether it's biometric specific laws, which we see more and more of being addressed at or proposed at state level. These principles, I think, have the opportunity to be really influential in how some of the either definitions or frameworks or boundary setting occurs as those legislative and then subsequent regulatory conversations happen. So the value of this work, I think, will be seen for a long time in those conversations at those different legislative contexts. The principles, which again, as Nick covered, align very closely with traditional privacy principles and have been, very thoughtfully adapted to address particulars about voice technology, not only as a biometric, but as a particular kind of biometric, which with its own issues and new risks as are identified in the paper, which I think is really helpful. One of the, I think, sort of, lessons learned or use cases that I think I have certainly learned from in starting to deal with voice technology is the sort of how facial recognition developed sort of ad hoc and ahead of its skis, so to speak, in terms of it was being used in places without necessarily thoughtful boundary setting ahead of time, or these kinds of privacy principles or other various types of bias and checking and things like that on it. And it was just sort of there all of a sudden, and then spreading more broadly and being used in all kinds of different ways without necessarily taking the time either at the industry level or at the regulatory level or even at the social, ethical, community level to decide how that technology fit in with any country's particular values or individual freedoms or things like that. And now we're, sort of caught in this position of trying to backtrack and pull back or put the fences up once it's already out there in use. And one of the things that I like so much about the Open Voice Network is that it has been attempting all along to get out in front of that challenge for voice, which I think has the potential to be even more impactful in many ways because of voice as an interface with so many systems in our homes, in our cars, with our mobile devices, at our work. It's just literally going to be everywhere. I think somebody was giving some numbers already about percentages of people interacting with these systems every day. I think we all recognize that that's us and how that's going to influence it. So putting these into context of how the challenges around voice are going to be unique, what some of the guidelines and thoughts should be behind how to create limitations, I think is like I said, going to be very valuable. So there's going to be some friction along the way. In the GDPR context, consent is not the primary focus for data collection. So it may be that as biometric use and especially voice use expands as a user interface, that maybe has get some sort of adjustment, or voice and other biometrics have a different set of standards that include a higher level of consent or a higher priority for consent as one of the mechanisms for the legal collection of data, or if not, other ways to increase the value of the other principles to still create the sufficient privacy protections within certain business models or applications and use cases that might leverage other authorized collection frameworks. So each of these, I think, which Nick already really pretty covered the individual principles, has a very specific value to business, to industry, to individuals who are interacting with these systems, and to the governments trying to regulate them. So since we only have a few minutes left, I'll just leave it at that, and then happy to, have questions and we can talk through further.
So, thank you, Brenda, and for sharing your perspective. And I think the legal implications are so important. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put them in chat. But I do have a follow-up question for you, Brenda, just that has been teed up. You kind of touched on somewhat on bias, but what is the relationship? We think of bias from an ethical standpoint, but what is the relationship with between bias and privacy?
I see a question popping up in the chat about bias and fairness. So I'm happy to answer that. That actually the work that I do every day is focused on AI, machine learning models, and bias assessments of those models in the goal of achieving whatever the level of fairness is. So the real fast answer to that question is fairness is sort of the standards that you set that you're going to measure your bias against. And there's lots of other ways to define both of those, but for the purposes of this and how they relate to each other, fairness is not a thing that is going to have a consistent, always the same definition. So fairness is going to be defined largely in the context of what the use case is. Bias then is going to be how you measure whether you're achieving your goal of fairness. That's at least one, working way of understanding those two concepts and their relationship. And to me, the implications of bias are with privacy are part of that whole accuracy and expectations and trust. So bias in a system is not directly about the collection and use that privacy starts with or focuses on, but it's obviously about the trust in that system and its ability to perform in the way that it says that it will. So equal access to people, which in voice might mean with different accents or languages or speech styles or volume or pitch, is part of the accessibility standard that we would want that would tie to accuracy and security of those systems. Bias is addressed in many cases, by data collection and testing and use of that data. And so that, of course, aligns with the privacy needs of people understanding that their voice recordings may be used either with their consent or with whatever other framework is in place to make the systems better and more reliable for people in those categories and communities. And so I think that they're very closely aligned in terms of the same values of trust and reliability for the user.
All right, thank you. And Nick, one question for you. You spoke today from your perspective of the co-moderator of Privacy and Security Work Group. You're also CEO of a conversational AI company that's focused on healthcare, home healthcare. How does the privacy principles apply? How are you applying those within your company?
Yeah, that's a great question, Oita. And to say that it's been easy would be, I'd be stretching the truth a bit there. But what's been interesting is as, I've been learning more about privacy, and as we've been working on producing this paper, as we really come to commercialization with our conversational AI platform, a lot of the initial discussions we're having with potential partners are, we want to be as consent driven. We need to be as consent driven as possible, especially when our platform is going to be the front door essentially for patients for some of these at-home medical tests. What are your thoughts on consent? Because this is how we view consent from a voice standpoint, but, we also have to provide them with a certain degree of data. So it's how do we incorporate being transparent and letting the patient know what they're getting themselves into, but at the same time, how do we balance control and limited collection, transparency and consent with making sure that we can provide essential data for our partners and providers we're working with as well. I think the biggest thing is still overcoming that design of how do we include how do we make some of these notifications easily accessible for the patient via text to speech, right? And I think that's a design hurdle that we'll be actively working through for the foreseeable future. But overall, the reception from potential partners we've been talking to has been positive, and they see it and they get why it needs to be done, especially in the context of one, healthcare, anything with healthcare, right, is incredibly sensitive and needs to be managed properly, but let alone in the home, an even more sensitive space. So that's really how we've been looking at applying these principles.
All right. So we are the Open Voice Network, and we began in on time, and we just really want to thank everyone for their time today. And we want to, let's continue the conversation. Please join us. If you are part of Open Voice Network, we have a Slack channel, Privacy and Security. We also, the Privacy and Security Work Group, we meet on Tuesdays on a weekly basis at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And so we look forward to seeing all of you who will be sharing this information, and as well as the process for feedback on our document. So visit us at openvoicenetwork.org/resources to find a white paper and other resources. So thank you all for your time today.